Welcome to our last, whoops, a little early, 1 minute or so early. We have Claudia Oy here. Is that the right pronunciation, Oy? Who will talk about food at the end of the session, but I'm eager and hungry to hear what she'll tell us. Let's see if we have any other questions or announcements before we get started from Claudia or anyone? Claudia, you might sort of prepare if you have PowerPoint or get ready to be able to share your screen if you want to do that. Any questions on things like that? Maybe Claudia is not connected yet. Or are you just on mute?
Yes, I'm connected. I will get ready.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Let me see. Yeah, we're just on the early end. All right, let's get started. This is our last session of the course, a review session for the whole, for your minds, your memories, your codification of the little pieces, and incidentally, the exam, assuming you're taking it. The advantage of having the midterm as late as it is that you've already done the exam, which is very, very close. We covered almost all the sections there. So it basically gives you a second shot. So to improve, to do better. And a couple of people are particularly concerned about doing very well, and they're doing extra contributions, extra material writings. And this is as consistent with the email from John Boyer, Dean of the College. He sent out reminding that the reading period is 3 or 4 days in the 10th week. And that is to permit you to do, reflect, put together things, do memos of exactly this sort. So the deadline for those is, as I sent out in an email a couple of weeks ago, is the Thursday of 10th week. Sorry, Wednesday. Wednesday. Let me read this. The final exam is the 15th. The 16th is the deadline for global local paper and your manuscript Word doc file. Yeah, that is reminder. Everyone is invited, please, to put all of your participatory writings together. If you've posted them on Canvas, if you've sent notes to your grandmother and said, "Grandma, here's a really interesting discussion we had of," and then you had some interesting comments and grandma said, "Oh, I heard that 75 years ago." And your dialogue with her, I mean, that's fine. Your document, your MS Word document with all of that is due Wednesday of 10th week, March 16, the day after the exam, and the reading period is basically a couple of days just before then. So that's all in the 10th week. The folks who are graduating, is this correct? I'm asking our TAs. That exam is for most of them settled for tomorrow at class time.
Yeah,
Good.
tomorrow class time 4:30 to 5:50. And
Okay.
for the people who are graduating, if you can submit your participation material by Friday, that would be great so that we can start working on the grading and also, yeah.
Excellent. I got good to remind us of that because that can be important too. And that's Thursday and Friday, March 10 and 11 tomorrow and the next day, because we in turn have to turn in the grades. I think that Friday night, Saturday, or something like that. Okay. Okay. I will remind you if you don't have a clear memory that in our review session for the midterm exam, which maybe someone else, if Abhishek could, if you could look up just the date of that session, the date of the midterm and the day before, I gave you pretty much a review of many different sections of the course. So I'm trying not to do that. I'm trying not to do that again. That is, I went through clearly, I mean, I did it very selectively, but I gave you a few comments, some big points from most of the sections of the course. And I'm open to any questions. I mean, we can discuss anything that's useful for you now, but I want to leave more initiative to you to ask questions than I did then, as that was, and as you've now done the midterm, and and you have the whole course before you. So questions, comments of any sort, discussion points, all kinds of things that we could raise here. Susanna.
Hi, I have it written in my notes that strong states have declined due to globalization and global pressure, and I was just wondering if you could explain why.
Okay, good point. I think that is one proposition alone, and I will just point out that one big point we've made throughout the course is that any one variable or a relationship, as that proposition states, between two variables, more globalization, weaker, may lead to a weaker individual state, is what the economists call a ceteris paribus, an other things equal kind of proposition. It assumes that it works in isolation, that context does not matter and nothing else is going on. But one thing that we've been stressing in various ways throughout the course is that nothing really works that way, even in the long run. And rather than assuming that kind of strong statement, we're proposing, and some economists are now doing more of this, is to, from the beginning, say, what is there about the context that may lead to this proposition to be stronger or weaker or not to hold at all? And so rather than assuming, or even though we can, making that kind of assumption we know is misleading, we can try to, right from the beginning, say where and why might this be particularly true, or might this be less true? And of course, this is in the context of all the other propositions on the syllabus, and where you see many of them are deliberately included because they contradict each other. So in the case of Saskia Sassen, where we talked about globalization can lead to more inequality, that's what she's famous for. And then she shows us with data for New York, which led people in London to say, why publish a paper called Why Sassen is Wrong, because the London data don't hold it up. And I'm answering in this way, using this example to illustrate my more general point. who remembers why Sasson was wrong finding that showed why that proposition did not hold or did not hold at all as well in London as it did in New York? Emery.
Hi, I actually have a question about the midterm. So I'm
wait.
graduating.
Okay, wait. Sorry, we're trying to, but we want to change the topic, but not till we answer this question. So if you have
Okay.
your hand up, it's to answer that. And who has an answer, a proposed answer to the question of why might Sasson be wrong? Or was using the data which he looked at? Okay. Well, his general statement was the context of London is different from the context of New York. And the context of London is that we already had a stronger welfare state in London. And in most of it was national. It was called the welfare state, usually is a national term. And it included more support for unemployment or lower income workers than did the US, especially people losing their jobs. And so, and then there were a variety of other things. And this I will just add in turn that this is a strong criticism, a stronger criticism of New York from London than it would have been if he had chosen, let's say, Paris or Beijing, which have much stronger states than England. I mean, England is arguably, the UK is arguably the weakest, one of the weakest states on some dimensions in Europe. And so if it undermines the finding there, it's particularly troublesome for a Sasson kind of proposition. Okay. So the idea then, so why might globalization, so let's back up. Why did Sasson make her proposition, which fits with Suzanne's question? That is, how does globalization work for Sasson? And why does it lead to more inequality? You have lots of examples we talked about. Shublaxmi.
If I remember correctly, then Sasson's argument was that globalization works in a spatial sense. So metropolitan cities become these nodal points of commercial relationships, and a lot of the key functions of industries, of new kinds of industries whose parts are more dispersed across the industry, will come together in these cities. So at one end, incomes at the higher level will continue to rise, and consequently the disparities with the lower levels of incomes will continue to grow apart. I mean, at least that was one of her arguments when she said that the key functions of the biggest industries that connect different cities in the world will be concentrated in particular cities. And then their income levels will grow up, and opportunities and the structures of opportunities for jobs will change.
Okay, I mean, that's compelling, and that's what she said for the affluent people, the Wall Streeters, let's say. How does that connect to, and how does that explain the inequality? How does that make the difference between the rich and the poor grow, which you haven't spoken to? You talked in your first sentence or so about the disparity geographically between metropolitan areas, implying maybe a national comparison, but can you elaborate just to try to be clear?
I think with reference to incomes, she talked about how there would be more service demands from low wage jobs. So while high skilled jobs would increase and hence the more affluent people will be able to generate more income, low levels of skill, jobs that require low levels of skill will be sort of driven out of cities or will cease to be as popular or will cease to require as much labor as they did before. So the kind of opportunities that are available to people of lower incomes will decline.
Okay, that may be true, but that's not her main argument. Anybody want to try to bring in her main argument, Claudia?
So if we take, again, the example of Wall Street and Wall Street firms, these firms are provide producer services and get a large return on capital, and subsequently they pay their finance workers very well. And then these finance workers are now able to hire their own employees, like their own drivers, their own cleaners, and their own nannies, which create these tranches of wealth. I think this is what Sasan says, right?
Yes, exactly. That's her argument. It's not that those workers are driven out of New York. These are nearby, maybe even living in the same apartment or nearby, or they try to live nearby if they can afford it. The affluent people in New York, because they're serving them. They make their nannies, their cooks, their chauffeurs, or they work in pastry shops which are patronized especially by the more affluent folks. That's Sasan's argument. So if that were, so we don't want to spend too much time, but I'm trying to bring in a little bit of the context so we can see where and why this might change with globalization. So let's stick with Sasan again. How and why is there not just a level, but this is a classic economics kind of way of thinking. We'll say what leads not to a level of difference, that is the difference between the level of income which you may earn if you're Wall Street is say $1 million, and if you're a chauffeur, you may earn $50,000. How does that change if we have, say, 5-year changes in New York City in conjunction to try to test that proposition? So the idea is if the Wall Streeter gets more money with globalization, why and how might that affect the local chauffeur? Following Sasan's reasoning again. I mean, and let me ask now, what is Sasan's reasoning here, and does it connect with any other reasoning that we have read about in this first section of the course? You all should know this. I've said this 3 or 4 times, and you should have all read about it. It's a simple takeaway question. Another way I've asked the same question is, what's the definition of globalization in Adam Smith? Because in this regard, Sasan is using Adam Smith's idea. It's not hers, it's Smith. It's classic Chicago economics. Answer, you should all know, the extent of the market is Smith's term. And in this example, how does that operate for increasing or changing the salaries or the earnings, including bonuses of the Wall Street active, let's say, accounting firm or market investor, portfolio manager of a Wall Street firm compared to his chauffeur? What is the extent of the market for the Wall Streeter and for his chauffeur?
Is it much larger for the Wall Streeter compared to the chauffeur?
That's the big point. Yes. And what you say bigger, much bigger, meaning in this example, just add another sentence or two to show how it works.
Like the Wall Streeter can be working on transactions or services that are global in scale and affecting a variety of different industries or locations, whereas the local chauffeur is really just working on a local scale and driving that Wall Street around from neighborhood to neighborhood within New York.
Exactly. Okay, that's perfect. Everybody should remember that. That's the core idea. Okay, now how can we generalize that? So basically we're now, the change, which I asked you about, is an increase of globalization, just as we're measuring the level of globalization, which we could have, say, for instance, if we have in five years ago, half of the Wall Streeter business was outside the US. And in 5 years, it may have gone up to 60% of his business may be outside the US. He's had to learn about new investments available in Latin America, for example. His firm asked him to learn about Latin America because you have a Mexican background. We want you to include more possible investment in Brazil and Argentina and so forth. So he does that. The size of the portfolio he's managing increases, which is internationally, and he gets paid 110,000 or say, or 1,100,000 instead of just 1 million. The point is, globalization has represented there by an increase in the size of the market which he's dealing with. And his market in this sense is where he invests, where he puts the money that people are investing in that, let's call it a exchange traded fund or a mutual fund or something like that. So in that sense, how should that lead to a change? And this is, we're now getting back to Suzanne's original question. How should that lead to, I'm trying to remember myself the proposition you had. The dependent variable was weakening of the, remind me?
Of strong states?
Weakening of strong states. Okay. Well, if we take, for example, a very recent change, if President Biden has said, nobody can import Russian oil, and we don't want American petroleum companies and other American corporations to invest in Russia, that could drastically cut the extent of the market for those Wall Streeters who were really totally heavily specialized on Russia or Soviet, former Soviet areas where the Russians have been particularly active. All right, so that might decrease the amount of money which they would have to be able to be invested in that area. That might be translated, if they're whatever, into a lower salary for that one. That is, let's say if we stay with the firm, clearly firms that specialize in Russia or East European or maybe petroleum investments are likely to suffer with the new law that globalization should be decreased by cutting out the Russian investments. And that in turn could well lead to so the proposition globalization, how could that lead to more? How could national, what was your dependent variable again? It was a stronger national state.
Yes.
Okay, so in this sense, the strength of the national state is Biden's statement saying less globalization. So he's, in a sense, it's a feedback loop. A leads to B, or X leads to Y, Y leads to Z, and that in turn decreases so that the stronger national state decreases the extent of globalization from time 1 to time 2, and that in turn weakens so I'm sorry, I'm mixing the inequality with a strong national state. Maybe I'm doing too much at once, but I'm trying to do that in part to add context and why this proposition works with the strength that it does. Okay, so if we then maybe add a few sentences on that, why might the Biden, or how might the globaliz, let's think through a couple of loops here. If we back up, say, to the strong Russian state, if Putin, people are saying Putin wants to increase, to recreate the USSR, he therefore wants to include Ukraine. Strong state wants to be stronger. The globalization of people on the NATO side says no. And they say that because of more, let's try to keep this. I don't want to make it too subtle, but I mean, maybe back up to, so if we go back a couple of centuries, it would be much more easy, or don't have to go very, very far historically. Individual nation states could do this and succeed much more easily 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, as there was less globalization. And that's the proposition. Take an example, a famous, a widely discussed example, documented example is Chile. Chile had a military dictator for a while, and he let's say, created many cases of human rights being violated, and people took those to international courts. Even at the time when he was president, he then was no longer president, and there were battles went on to try him and extradite him from Chile to Europe, where he could be punished more severely than if he were just in Chile. So he said, well, I'm looking at concrete examples to give you a sense of how this might work in practice. The point was, over time, as the international courts of human rights grew stronger after World War II, with pressure from the United Nations and others, these led to weakening of the national state of Chile, in this example, was unable, and the same thing happened across many other Latin American countries, Mexico as well. The strong, especially military leaders who were predominant in much of Latin America 30, 40 years ago, roughly, were weakened as there was increasing globalization. And so one of the labels of this by some people in Latin America was, this is neoliberalism. You're bringing an international set of criteria, and the term was economic deterministic. Neoliberalism is an economic, market-oriented term, but they applied it even though my example is using human rights. So what I'm thus doing, I'm answering the question, but I'm bringing in 4 or 5 additional points which we've made throughout the course. I'm not doing them in as neat and clear and coherent as you can write an essay and say the same thing. But you could practice answering the question more coherently than I did, and that would be great. Who else has a follow-up or another? Yeah, Susanna, you asked it. You want to follow up on any of that? Or is anything that I wandered around too unclear, or you want to follow up with anything?
No, that was pretty good. Thank you.
Okay. We had someone who, Emery, did you have a question about the midterm? Still there?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, my Wi-Fi is not great. I'm in the library, but I am taking the final tomorrow as a graduating senior, and I was wondering if we were going to get our midterm grades back by today, and be able to look at comments as well.
We hope so. You got general comments on everyone already today. Those were the main comments on the essays. So read those, and those were very well stated by Sharon, and he's read through all the main essays and given you the, I'd say, the most important comments which you can have from the midterm. So,
Do you have any advice on the IDs?
short answer is no. Everything I've been saying through the whole course should be reflected in, it can be reflected in the IDs and in the essays. That is, we deliberately include in the course readings and in what I've said, we're giving you either contradictory or complementary propositions, and you can show that in your answers. What I'm trying to say is one big point through the course. I mean, what are other 2 or 3 big general points through the course that you all should be able to take away? Emery, what are some general points that could fit into almost any ID or any essay that you picked up in this course? Question, what do you answer to that? There are many things I've said at least three times. And I've said a couple of them today.
Hello?
And were you listening or only thinking about your question? I'm teasing you. Turning off your camera? Who else? Okay, here we go. Xing, go ahead.
Was one of the points about like the extent of the market with like Smith and Sossen's ideas?
Yes, for sure. That's one. That's one, and that's the. Okay, go ahead. Who has another one? Just looking for general points, sort of like that.
I think you've talked about how we need to both look on a global scale, but also local scales on examples that we bring in.
Yes, very much so. And to try to look at instances where global and local may go together and reinforce each other, or they may be in contradiction. So you can have a national COVID policy or a national policy to stop buying Russian goods, but other people who love caviar from Russia will be very unhappy. And some of those restaurant owners may be trying to buy, all the caviar they can get right now. So they'll be able to keep serving it, whatever happens to importing of caviar from Russia, for instance. So good examples. How about another example from anybody? General points that if you want to point out to how these points are or are not stressed in your other courses in the social sciences or in literature or in natural science, I'd welcome a brief mention of those too. Claudia?
I think we've spent a lot of time talking about like mechanisms of globalization, like how in history it was transportation and railroads, and then more recently it's been internet and wireless connectivity, and then bringing into that like Friedman's idea of the world is flat and how globalization contributes to both equality and inequality.
Perfect. Excellent general, major, central points. Have another one like that from anyone? What did we learn from, say, Max Weber and Robert Dahl? And both of them were really criticizing implicitly or explicitly someone else. And that tended to be, and this is a good example for, this is a debate that still continues today in the interpretation of the Ukraine and of Putin, for instance. Putin is seen by many as strong, hierarchical, a tough leader. I want to do this. And the West and the US are portrayed in many of the US media as open and pluralistic and more democratic. How does that relate to points we've read through in the course? Instead of leaving it as sort of quasi propaganda or potential, mass media simplification, what have we read that is core social science in Max Weber and Dahl? And who's an example of someone they were both criticizing? So let's say Marx. They're both criticizing Marx, but there are many Marxes, many ideas from Marx. They weren't criticizing everything. What was one of the main things that they were criticizing? And it was less Marx, who they knew was brilliant. It was individual Marxists, lower level, less creative political party people who were using kind of Marxist ideas in a more simplified way, which they were criticizing. And what's an example which again continues today, and on student groups on this campus and elsewhere. Multidimensionality and multi-causality. Okay, what are those two? How do those two concepts relate to this course in ways we've discussed and you've read about? Multidimensionality could be, what are ideas in Dahl and in Weber which illustrate multidimensionality in readings and discussions we've had here? Okay, multidimensionality can be Max Weber stressing, you don't have just class, you also have status. And then those both can influence the power or the party policy programs. So what that's saying is class alone is not enough. Class is too simplified and deterministic in explanation. And if we add what Weber talked about as status, but when he discussed status, he had many, many examples. He talked about religious status. He talked about servants. He talked about feudal lifestyle and modes of dress. So he basically had many. It was really it wasn't just two or three dimensions. It was lots of things which were implicit, but he just used one new term, status. When we get to Dahl, what is their parallel in Dahl's work on New Haven that is analogous to this? What are some of his biggest concepts in Who Governs? One of the most general I already used, and it's what he talked, and he sometimes used it as a label, pluralism. And the idea was there's not one actor like Putin. There are also other actors like the Polish, like the Saudi Arabians, like the Chinese, like the Germans buying or not buying oil, like the Germans supplying weapons or not. And the Germans held up on this until, practically the beginning of the Ukrainian invasion. But they've now reversed their position in a very strong, important way. So that's not Putin. That's really let's say it's not Putin alone. The Germans wouldn't have to have done that, but what it points to is multi-causality and the complications of a one-factor explanation. So pluralism is one. Second big concept in Dahl. Issue areas. What are issue areas? Illustrated by the kinds of empirical studies he did in New Haven. What are the three main issue areas he studied in New Haven? These are things you could or should put in an ID. If we had, say, pluralism as an ID, you should be able to answer these now from having heard this multiple times. Okay, The 3 issue areas he studied were mayoral election of the mayor, the school board decisions of big decisions for schools in New Haven, and third, economic development. Okay, so that's the multi-dimensionality part. The second interrelated piece of that is multi-causality. And how does that connect and make that a compelling point in his empirical work? He was criticizing not so much Marx directly, but more directly the neo-Marx Floyd Hunter and the other people who followed a simple economic deterministic kind of view, who saw and wrote economic elites dominate politics in the world, and especially in American cities. And so the book by Hunter and the second book by the Linds called Middletown in Transition, I pointed out the first book did not say this. In the Depression, they went back to the same town and they wrote a new book, which was neo-Marxist. And so the context of the recession transformed their view of how serious the economy is, and which you don't take for granted if you don't have a depression going on all around you. But the general point was, in each of those 3 issue areas, you did not have the same kind of domination. You did have business dominance in the economic development issue area. So for building or development projects like building a new hotel or building a new set of apartments, those decisions tended to be dominated by people who were bankers, who were developers, who were construction companies, who would borrow money and hire workers to build a new bank or a new housing project. By contrast, the big point was, to refute Hunter, was in mayoral elections, these actors were much weaker and much less present, or let's say less important, even if they wanted to be present. And then third, in terms of schools, these developers were just not involved. And so that we then followed up with the comparative studies in other cities, which showed the same kind of thing when we asked the comparative question. Instead of asking the Hunter question, who's the most important person or persons in Atlanta, we would preface it and say, in the economic development decisions, who were the most important participants? In the school board decisions, who were the most important participants? In the, so in each of the issue areas, if we add that as a prefatory question, that transformed the answers across the US. So we did the first comparative study nationally, which asked these kinds of questions, and we got exactly, I won't say, but no, I get, the quick point is, both Dahl and Hunter were right in some cities. That is, there were some cities that were more hierarchical across all issue areas. In other cities, not at all. Okay. One more concept of Dahl, which may relate to multi-causality and multi-dimensionality. Let me, yeah, no, okay. Slack. What is slack in terms of Dahl's discussion? And what are the components of slack when you're talking about who governs? It relates to another key concept, resources. How did Dahl use the idea of resources, and why is it important in thinking about all of these? These are All these are interrelated concepts, issue areas, pluralism, issue specificity, Slack, mobilization of resources. None of these are in Hunter. Hunter and people who talk about, many people, but the simple discussion of neoliberalism is to say, if everything is economic and money is all that counts, there's only one kind of resource, and it's not even a resource, it's everything, it's power. Money's power. How often do you hear that? Power is everything, you know, where's the beef? That we hear widespread. What is a quick answer to where's the beef question, which you've heard in this course? How much explanation does money have of, and we heard this perhaps in Subbulakshmi's presentation about India. Were these rich people versus poor people? No, it's really Muslims versus Hindus. So money is not everything, even in a poor country like India. Poorer. That is, I've had many students from India say, oh yes, everything in India is rich versus poor. And I said, are you sure? Let's take an issue. So I then say, let's go look for some data on India. You know, get something that compares richer people and poorer people in India and see how much difference it makes in how they answer, etc. So the quick point, the big point I'm making that you should have heard in the course many times is how much variance is explained by, let's say, money and voting, or money and closing down a university in India if it is a Muslim university where students have been protesting against a strong Hindu leadership. How much variance might be explained by that if we had the data to answer that quantitatively? 10 or 15%. So I'm not an Indian specialist, and if we sampled in a certain way, for sure we could find people for whom it's higher than 10 or 15%. But if we took, for instance, all the Muslims in India and all the Hindus in India and asked them a range of questions, you mean, would you permit your child to go to a university if there were more Hindus or more? I mean, if we asked a variety of questions about, I mean, ask all the Hindus in India, should we close down all of the slaughterhouses, so that the beef slaughterhouses, so that Muslims cannot eat meat? And the Hindus, and so some Hindus will say, yes, we should close them down because I don't like Muslims being able to do that, being able to eat beef. And the national government has done some of that. That is, they did close some slaughterhouses, and that led to protests internationally and in Pakistan and other places by people saying, you know, this is an openly anti-Muslim policy of closing slaughterhouses. But it wasn't, okay, but the point was, it's an issue-specific point, and one could measure how many Hindus, citizens in India, and if we had data on that, I bet it would be about 10 or 15%. Okay, so I'm making 2 or 3 overlapping points. If we have multi-causality, multi-dimensionality, no one thing explains everything else. So if we come back to Slack is a situation where not everybody is mobilizing all of their resources. If we're mobilizing all their resources, we're getting closer to, let's say, what the troops are doing. The Russian troops and the Ukrainian troops are there. I mean, they're really fighting for their lives. This is a very, very serious, you know, life extermination, potentially nation extermination kind of war, which is going on. But the people who don't really care about this, they left a long time ago, or they left in the last few weeks. They've gone abroad, and so, you know, their concerns are bigger than state. Whereas the people who want to fight are going, or they're leaving. You know, they're leaving Germany, they're leaving England, they're leaving Norway. They're going to Ukraine now, and they're I mean, they're a small number of people. These people are committed to fighting and preserving their Ukrainian distinctiveness. Okay, so those people have very low Slack. That is, that this is the I'm choosing the Ukrainian and these people who are really committed because they're using a large proportion of their resources. They're potentially going to die in these battles. This is very serious stuff. Most people don't ever engage that seriously in politics. They might vote, they might talk about politics with their friends before an election, but to actually get in an airplane and say, I'm willing to die because I feel this strongly about fighting, that's a showing the difference between normal, quote, politics in most countries and what can happen when you have both sides really mobilizing their resources in a tough, life-threatening way. And we saw that in the Middle East. We've seen this in other situations. But even Hong Kong, Hong Kong with the Chinese was nothing like that. Most of the Hong Kong residents were not in the streets. It's a very small proportion of the Hong Kong population was in the streets. Either way, okay. Okay, other questions, comments?
This is a pretty simple question, I guess, but is the final going to be in a similar format to the midterm?
Exactly. Yes. Very similar in spirit, and it will draw heavily on the syllabus and just the kinds of questions which I'm asking now to try to help. We're not trying to trick or surprise you. We're trying to cover the core ideas coherently. Suzanne?
Is it going to be longer than the midterm?
No, you mean in terms of time, or?
Yeah, like
the time is the same time length as the class time, or it may be 10 minutes more, it may be 2 hours, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think it's 2 hours.
Yeah. So I'm sorry. So yes, it's 10 minutes more. There was a standard registrar time allocation that way. Maybe because you don't have to go to your next class and take another exam. And so you don't get those extra 10 minutes for changing rooms. Was their reasoning. More questions? Alex, I think maybe did you have your hand up for a bit and had something?
I think it was just earlier, and it was a question that I believe someone else answered. So it was something that's already been gone over. So no, not anymore. Thank you though.
Any other thoughts on the whole course? For Alex, what are two things you learned in this course you haven't heard in other courses at the USC?
I think one would be probably the globalization theory of Sasson is something new and interesting to me, especially the idea of like the entrenchment of so like it was interesting to see how she brought in like that the global system is not necessarily mutually beneficial for all parties, and that it allows a certain actor to I don't know, gain wealth and gain access to market while restricting another actor to being more somewhat localized and more hyper competitive. But I did have a quick question, maybe it's more of a refresher, which is just you were talking about Dahl and like multi-causality and multi-dimensionality and all this stuff. Is he saying in this that like because power is derived,
Is it easy to turn on your camera?
Oh yeah, sorry. That power is derived like not just from, like he says, it's not just derived from the masses or the elites or whatever, it's a mix. He's saying power is also like a mix of economic and like military power, correct? Or am I misremembering or misspeaking there?
Well, if you get to say economic and military, I guess, but Dahl's big point is talk about explicitly issue specificity. So you use those terms, military and economic, but maybe to answer are how tightly interconnected is the military and the political. The answer may come better from later work than Dahl, and I would say that's more the comparative studies, which try to say, why are the military and the economic more close or not, or why are some cities more close to hunters, business domination of everything? And there were examples like Dallas and Houston, which in certain years in the past looked much more that way than did, for example, New Haven or places in New England where there was a more explicit tradition of citizen engagement, participation, multi-causality, pluralism, civic group activation, media criticism of elites, and so forth. Whereas these Texas cities did not have those, which is the political culture joining to try to answer why are the economic and military issue areas closer or further apart. Using military very loosely here, which could be the police, which could be violence or control of it, or even if you wanted, you could take, say, how many volunteers do we have to go into the army in the American South versus New England? And the ideal, the simple answer is, it's, as I've quoted, the American military speaks with a Southern accent. The strong or the weaker entrepreneurial, individualistic economic activities in the South, instead the domination of the large plantations with staff being slaves as the simplified label. That kind of model tended to lead people who were maybe a little more different to go into the military. And so, I won't try to elaborate beyond that, but that is, I'm just bringing in ways of specifically including the military nationally and joining that with the Southern traditions to say why and how is it linked with the economy or not. Or I think I may have mentioned the quotations that I've saw myself in the New Orleans Museum of the City of New Orleans. There were visitors to New Orleans in the 1840s, 1850s, who would say, all these men in New Orleans, these proper men, they don't go to work. They go to parties and they ride horseback. The horseback part links to the military, potentially. It's a classic aristocratic, these are European aristocratic models, as including especially snubbing work, saying, not talking about what do you do for an occupation. That's, if you're a proper person, you don't think about that or talk about that. So the novels like Stendhal, the great French continental novelists did not talk about work. They did talk about the military. They talk about your rank, you're being assigned to a French provincial city as a military officer, and you would therefore go to the parties of people in that town, and you would wear your uniform in an elegant way, and the lovely ladies would say, "Oh, what a handsome lieutenant you are," and so forth. And so you in turn would say, "Oh, what are you doing for dinner tomorrow night?" etc. Okay, so that's part of the military as described by 19th century French novelists. And that's not quite the same as fighting in the Ukraine today, obviously, where the president takes his fancy uniform off and puts on a t-shirt. Okay. Let me just, Claudia.
I think three concepts I'm still struggling a little bit to word cohesively is moralism, neoliberalism, and what you call the creative class?
Okay, good questions. Creative class, just quickly, the term comes from Richard Florida's book, The Rise of the Creative Class. And Richard Florida himself wrote the book, and he did not use that title. It was the publisher that gave it to it, because there is no creative class really in the book. So it's a media labeling without a background analysis, the way you really have in Marx. Say, for instance, Marx is the classic analysis of how classes work and are important. So I mean that's the quick answer there. The Richard Florida more serious answer is without conceptualization. He did use measures. And so he had some measures. I mean, the simplest measure of the creative class is people who do not work with their hands. So anybody who does not use a shovel or whatever, and who instead uses a typewriter or a computer, you're part of the creative class. So that may be 60, 70, 80% of the total state or country, depending on where you go. On the second one, I mean, these are more, well, let's say, I guess the second one, neoliberalism, that's simpler than the moralism question. Neoliberalism, we had a couple of sessions on that, and I mentioned it briefly now with a Latin American example. Anybody want to comment on that term and how it's used and how it fits with the course or doesn't, and what we've got to say that's distinctive? That is, I'm picking on that because many of the concepts we're using are close to both traditional social science concepts like class and status and pluralism, and they're close to media debates right now: the Ukrainian war, diversity, gender roles. These are all things which are related to readings in the course. Who wants to comment on neoliberalism? What is it? Where's it come from? How does it relate to the course and the like? The specific, there's a section on this in the discussion we had of Mocus as mayor of Bogota, and I did a paper. Mocus invited me when after the new political culture came out. He had a conference of really the mayors of the major cities in Colombia during the war, and it was too dangerous for them to leave their mayoral locations. Something like 40% of the mayors had been assassinated. 40% of all the mayors in Colombia have been assassinated by gangs and civic groups and so forth. So we were talking to each other online, and Mocus had basically said, what can we do to transform the cities of Colombia to make them more livable and to take away the domination and the violence and the difficulties which we've had. And he was fighting most explicitly with his own city council. And the rules of the game which they were using in the city council were basically clientelism and drug money, maybe some oil, but basically the big economic driver was drugs. And so that not to saying that the city council members were themselves involved, but they could have gotten contributions from, and I don't want to go in detail, but this is the outside label. So what he did was to do things that were symbolically transformative in ways that he tried. And I'll remind you what I think I said as well in the Middle East. How did the national governments of countries like Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt criticize and undermine ISIS? This is now a question about how the arts can make a difference. They hired people like cartoonists, musicians, storytellers to do things that were humorous and made fun of ISIS. They didn't say, you're wrong, you're bad, or whatever. They said, you didn't get it right, Dumbo, in our cartoons. So in that sense, that Mokus did the same thing. Mokus got married, and he and his wife each arrived on separate elephants, on the tops of elephants, and they sold tickets to their wedding. Anybody could buy a ticket and come and watch them get married. But they held this in a huge park in the middle of Bogota, which was considered a drug center where you could buy and sell drugs, and you could get, marijuana, cocaine, and other things if you just go to that park. So they symbolically were taking that park away from the drug people and the drug dealers and saying, this is part of Bogota, and I will hold my wedding here and redefine this park. And afterward, they used the money from the tickets to have other activities in the park. So they had, they had playground, they had all kinds of things. They had games and things which took the park away from the drug dealers or the drug, as well as the citizens who just wanted to buy the drugs. So in that sense, Mokus was using the arts, and he created an emotional, compelling scene of arriving on elephants to make it a humorous, campy is Susan Sontag's term, alienated is Brecht's term, or Marx's, the young Marx's term. You're combining elephants with drugs, with marriage in a park. How can you do all that? He did it, Okay. So in that way, what he's also doing is fighting against a neoliberal interpretation that he is representing the proletariat or the poor against the rich. His view, and very explicitly stated, was he wanted to represent all citizens equally, rich and poor. He was not just in favor of the poor, he was not just in favor of the rich. He tended to go after people who were creating problems, such as drug dealers or people who were driving their cars too fast. And so he used those people with costumes and as mimes, and they fired the whole traffic police because they were taking bribes and they were getting paid too much and they were doing a poor job. So with the mimes, they rehired other people, including the police if they wanted a job there. And they did it in a new way. And the surveys that they had, at least, they were trying to measure, is this, and they were trying to do different things and seeing if they mattered or not. And they found something like legitimacy rose about 6 times under Mokus in a short period of 4 years. Okay, so that means that in a sense that's ways of challenging neo-colonial, that is the label that neo-corporatism is, or neo-capitalism is money against people without money coming from abroad, and that in turn drives the economy, drives not just the economy, it drives food, it drives getting married, it drives drugs, and more. So it's a strike against one-factor determinism. Okay, the last one is the hardest, which is moralism. And I've mentioned that people, as particularly Aaron Wildavsky and Seymour Martin Lipset, have written about America is a moralistic country, that the most important distinguishing characteristic of American society is its moralism. And Elazar has added that this is true of New England. It's much less true of the Middle Atlantic states. And in some ways, you can find the opposite in the South. And so that's an overstatement. I won't say it's an overstatement. It's a slight simplification, slight, depending on, okay. It is a simplification, period. But the point, so moralism in this broad sense is not talking about theology. Theology may be a background element of it, but it's really a way of characterizing politics. these were political scientists, Elazar and Vildovsky, and Lipset's political sociologist. So basically, and they didn't invent this at all. I mean, they took this from American history, going back to the first presidents up to current, and they would stress the degree to which religious themes or transforming a potential political issue. And I gave you the example. What are two policies that were followed in the mid-19th century for trains and universities, or let's say trains and universities in capital cities of states? These are policies, concrete policies that link to moralism. How? You've heard me say this. University of Texas, where is its state capital? Austin. Where is its state university, the top campus? Austin. Wisconsin, where's the state capital? Madison. Where's the state university? Madison. These were small towns. The idea was, we want politics to be away from the dirty, corrupting, big, bad cities in the European style, and we want these moralistic farmers nearby, more rural people, to have their values as citizens dominate the children who are the going to college, and the state legislators who, instead of having nearby bars and restaurants and drugs and bad stuff going on, would have to, in the days of less fast airplanes and trains, would spend more of their time in the state capital, which was more unmoral, which was the state capital, which was moralistically uncorrupted. That was the simple idea, articulated best by Thomas Jefferson and the work around him, and then in implementing this over the 19th century as new states were created. And then funding was given, plus the trains linked to that as land grants. That is, this was Lincoln and Douglas both were involved in the Illinois Central Railroad, and these were national grants. We're getting, unless someone else have a strong question you want to ask. If not, let me not answer. Anybody else have a big question you want to ask for all of us? All right, we will then turn to Claudia, who's been asking excellent questions, and ask her to tell us about food as a globalizing topic. Please do.
Thank you. Can you enable screen sharing, please?
Now, this is Sharon, I think. Should that be done now, Sharon?
No, I'm the co-host. Today's host is Abhishek.
Okay, Abhishek, can you make Claudia co-host? Are you there, Abhishek? Okay, this is what I was trying to get us to do in advance, but we didn't quite get that done. All right, can you start without being co-host and just give us some of the big points? If he comes back in or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I wanted to share with the class, I'm an economics and classics double major. And so for my classics major, we are able to do a senior capstone project that is sort of any creative approach or anything related to your classes or things you can study that interests you. And I chose to do this project on food, specifically Roman cuisine. So I wove in translating Latin literature. There's this Roman cookbook that's really famous among the Latin literature called Apicius. And then I basically filmed this short cooking film or documentary that showed me discussing first of all, my personal history with food and interest in food, and then cooking a Roman feast and actually, bringing to life Epicurian recipes in the kitchen. Yeah, so as we've kind of discussed concepts in class, I thought that food, similar to entertainment, similar to art, can be seen as a globalizing phenomenon that connects culture, time, and space together. And, like food brings together people on both a local and a global scale. On a local scale, you have food as a commonality. So for example, my own family often chooses to spend time together over a meal, or over, going to different restaurants. And then on the more global scale, you have cultures being connected to each other, cultures being interpreted, and food as basically this emblem of culture. Yeah, and you also have on this global scale a memorialization of tradition. So for example, my project where I cooked Epicurian recipes, these recipes were developed like thousands and thousands of years ago, and it can still be pertinent and brought to life even in our modern day society. Yeah, so I was gonna play a little bit of the clip, but that's okay. And I thought I would also talk a little bit about how food relates to concepts that we've specifically talked about. So one is the world is flat. So this is something proposed by Thomas Friedman. And I thought that food can be in one of the 10 levelers that he describes. So for example, now that there's internet and now that there's wireless connectivity, I grew up in Hong Kong. If I'm missing home cooked food or foods that I can find in Hong Kong, I can go on YouTube and search up different recipes or different ways and methods to make food, even though I'm like seas away. I think also, the emergence of internet and social media. So food is huge on social media, and it just kind of shows how this sort of connectivity stretches across national borders and national cultures. And then I also thought that restaurants and going out to eat, similar to bowling clubs, can be a way of civic engagement. So you have participation of citizens within their communities. When you go to a restaurant, you are probably going with other people. So you're talking to other people about maybe current day or news or your community. You're talking to the waiter, you're interacting with community members next to you. And so this is another way that civic engagement can be established and can contribute to the legitimacy of a culture and of a nation and of a cultures or of a city or country's government. I think it also has to do with extent of market. So before there was globalization, so before there was ways for different ingredients or different things that are grown only in certain parts of the world to be transported across different national borders, or before there was internet connectivity and social media, and before the spread of knowledge about different food and cultures, your market for food or your market for different restaurants and tastes were limited to your own local surroundings. But now with the proliferation of globalization, you kind of see food as an example of something that's spread across nations. And finally, I thought one other point that we can talk about is migration. So we've also touched upon migration and frontier culture. So for example, when the US settled, or a lot of my family moved from China to Indonesia and brought with them a ton of local Chinese cuisines and Chinese traditions to even their immediate surroundings in Indonesia. So kind of thinking about how migration impacts the flow and knowledge of food. But yeah, those are my main concepts and how I was going to connect my senior capstone project from a totally different major to class concepts that we've talked about and discussed.
Yeah, Abhishek, she was asking if you could make her co-host, so because she wasn't able to present yet. If we got just 3 minutes, if there's a way we can let her show any of that, that would be great. But
yeah, I did. She's the co-host, she can present. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, everything you said was splendid, very clear, very splendid linking of your two majors, and very splendid linking with the course, as well as the specificity of the topic. Go ahead. So go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I quickly touched upon all the slides I had prepared. So I guess I can just show it to you guys briefly. This slide was just about how food can bring communities together on both a local and global scale. And how, we've spent a lot of time talking about Bollywood and art and entertainment, and how that's a form of culture and how that's a form of globalization. So I thought that food, can be an important component or subcategory of that. And then I also briefly explained like main points of how I thought food contributes to concepts and, identification terms that we've talked about in class. I guess I can briefly show you guys what the actual result of my senior projects looked like. So it was like basically this 30-minute video. So I started off with an intro discussing how I got interested in food, and then kind of my journey as an amateur chef. Basically, I like to cook and host a lot of people together all the time. Here's a little bit of the Latin component. So talking about translating this piece of Latin literature. And this is basically what manuscripts of the cookbook looked like that I was cooking from. And then the majority of the video is me demonstrating the cooking process.
Terrific.
Yeah, so I cooked several Roman dishes, a lamb dish, chicken meatballs, and you can kind of, let me see if I can see.
All right.
Yeah, so you can kind of see the different dishes that were made. But yeah, I can link it to you guys, and you guys can check it out after class if you guys want.
That's terrific. Oh, thank you so much. I mean, we talked briefly about slow food and fast food as Paris and Rome versus when the McDonald's and others started showing up in those cities. That generated a slow food movement, which even has support in the US. But we are out of time. That was a splendid presentation. Good questions, good discussion today. Thanks all. We had a couple of potential hands up. Is there something we need to do? Either we do it with the whole group here, and you can hang up if you like. But if there's something else, we can continue with office hours and pursue it there. Anybody still have a hand up for something important for? Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time for discussion of Claudia's presentation, but you can watch and try to cook with her. I'm impressed. In terms of presentations, you did not waste a word. You were very clear, very coherent. You very clearly and specifically linked the concepts from the course with your own focus on food. I mean, everything was great. A+. Okay. So why don't we keep the recording still running for a little bit and see if there's anything with the beginning of office hours, which may be more general that you want to discuss. If there's something more personal, we'll shut off the recording and discuss it that way. Anybody else staying on who wants to raise anything? Claudia or Charlotte?
Hi, I do have one more question.
Sure.
The final is going to be, I know we're saying it's the same, but it's also going to be like emailed to us the same way the midterm was at home. Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for a great quarter, Professor.
Thank you for splendid questions. Joining Chicago with the world. Suburbs and Central City. Okay. Suzanne or Claudia, anything else?
Thank you.
Thank you for making Rochester more central to all of us and including the non-named mayor. That was great.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Same to you.
Maybe I have one final question.
Sure.
Can we discuss the concept of egalitarianism? I understand that egalitarianism comes up in Lipset as one of the things that makes America exceptional. And then I also understand the example we talked about in class of Genghis Khan and how we can think about egalitarianism across a spectrum of societies, and how, on the one hand, you have Genghis Khan and this really strict militaristic society that's seen as the opposite of American society. But in some ways, Genghis Khan was actually extremely tolerant and extremely, I guess, promoted egalitarianism among his own army and constituents. So I have those specific examples, but I was wondering if I'm missing anything more broadly, or any just broader points that I should make.
I mean, those are perfect. I mean, I would say, just for a few more big points we talked about in the class, was 1789, the French Revolution. Napoleon, whose parents took him there to improve his French, even though he spoke with an Italian accent his whole life, and people made fun of him for it. He reversed many of his views of the hierarchy of the king and the Versailles lifestyle, and he became the egalitarian general and then emperor that spread this across Eastern Europe, Central Europe, all the way over to Egypt. Even maybe not applied with the depth in Egypt as it was elsewhere, but it was, but he did it with enough panache that he had people like Hegel and Beethoven, write aspects of their work, a whole symphony of Beethoven dedicated to the Emperor Symphony, etc. So 1789, 1848 in some ways, 1968, 1989. These are big dates that I mentioned with as markers of big activities that move in an egalitarian direction. The last two really being the self-destruction of the Soviet Union, Tiananmen Square, in 1989, 1968, the student revolts, the African-American revolts within US cities at their height, burnings, etc. But the pressures toward extending the application of egalitarianism more to African Americans, more to the poor, more to the disadvantaged, so that the welfare state concept began in the 19th century. There basically was virtually no welfare state. The Calvinists had families who would take people in and help them, but that both resisted having the state do so, as in France and Germany, where they just put the poor in poor houses. The Dutch instead took poor people into their own families, their own churches, and tried to help them become reformed, but treated them in a more egalitarian way, sitting at their own tables, having meals, living with them in their own homes, etc. So that form of egalitarianism came from Calvinism in the West, a specific, strongly implemented form of a slave religion. If Christianity was a slave religion, originally seen that way in Rome, your Rome, but it became the Vatican. It became the Roman, a pillar of the post-Roman Empire, globalization of Europe in that sense, through the Vatican and through the Roman Catholic Church, and in turn was then the source of battles through especially the 19th century in France and elsewhere in Italy, where many of these were battles towards secularization against the religious domination of the church, and especially the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, so those are big points that one could add about egalitarianism beyond what you said, but everything you said was fine.
Yeah, that's perfect. That was my final question. Yeah, I normally have a commitment, so I haven't been able to go to class. But yeah, I've been watching the lectures, and thank you for a great quarter.
Thank you for adding your plate, your multiple plates, and then showing us how you cook them yourself. So much appreciated. Yeah, you know, if I didn't know already, I'll add as a footnote that I worked for several years I lived in France, Paris for 5 years, taught at Sorbonne twice as a student there, and then interviewed all the chefs in the 3-star restaurants across France about how they did their meals. And the majority, what surprised me most in doing the field work was the majority, I mean, roughly 6 out of 10 of them said, I got my main recipes from my mother. I don't do anything new.
That's amazing.
This is the opposite of the creative class kind of image, which we have of many chefs are the opposite, of course, but that at least in the past and so the French have these two battles, you know, over nouvelle cuisine versus my mother's recipes. And you have, of course, this is central in China. I mean, so they have much longer tradition of grand cuisine in China. And so revolting against that or changing that is, but I spent a lot of time with our Scenes Academy talking about how the Chinese restaurants are doing this, but most of them are not.
I think it'll be interesting if there's a new term for the blend of a traditional creative class with something else. Like, for example, I run an Instagram for the different food I make and consume. And obviously it's not my profession, it's just a hobby. But for many people on TikTok or Instagram or YouTube, like cooking and delivering these recipes online is, can create a lot of monetary value for them. So on the one hand, they are still the creative class where they're producing something with their hands, but also in another aspect with globalization and with the rise of internet and connectivity of the world and creating these audiences for their work and for their can create these new job opportunities for them.
Absolutely, yes. But just to add a footnote, conversely, the Chinese have pointed out to me, and I've included now in some of my Chinese videos, one of the most popular television and internet heroes is a young lady who is doing pure traditional kind of cooking in the same way you demonstrated. She does the traditional, she goes out and picks the apples, picks the berries and so forth, and is showing the strength of continuing tradition for a young woman living in a quite affluent, attractive surroundings, but in a definitely rural, traditional setting. So that's a big Chinese trope, but not to play it down, but it's enthusiastically pursued by many Chinese, as well as, of course, the opposite with the Instagram stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always a pendulum. When society perceives one phenomenon going too far, they swing back to the old, and then they swing back to the new.
Right.
Yeah.
Lincoln Douglas, etc. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Okay, Hegel, Marx. Onward. Okay, anything else to add or ask?
No, I think I'm good. Yeah.
Thank you for participating. It was very nice. Perfect ending for the whole course.
Thank you.
Good. All right. Do we have anything else from Sharon or Abhishek you want to discuss with our recording still on for people?